ANC plunges in polls, GNU battles to get VAT increase agreed. Are we in a period of crisis for South African politics, or will it be more of the same? Let's get into it. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX fam. Great to have you on board again. And it's been a while since you and I have had a little chat together. We've done a lot of episodes and interviews, but I thought I'd check in to give my views on South African politics. Before I do that, just remember that SMWX has its first ever live event. I'm going to be in conversation with Herman Mashaba, followed by two SMWX legends, Gogo Aubrey Machikri and Tessa Dooms. It's on the 25th of April in Sandton. Check the comment that's pinned down below to get your tickets. Half the tickets have already been sold. And please make sure that you get some of your tickets for that live event. It's going to be a great evening, and it would be lovely to meet some of you, the SMWX community, in person. Right, in today's episode, I want to take a look at where things are standing in South African politics. A lot has been happening, particularly over the VAT issue. And we've also got some new polling which is out. And so I want to make sense of all that's going on right now as we go into a new moment in South African politics and the life of this multi-party coalition. So first, I want to talk about the polling that has come out of the SRF and the Institute of Race Relations and just analyze the importance of that going forward. Then I want to talk about these meetings that have been happening between coalition partners over the past weekend and where the GNU really stands at this point. Do we even have a GNU? Is it a scam? And if so, what can we expect going forward? And then finally, just reflect on some of the politics of opposition parties as well, because we've had a lot going on there too. So let's get started with some of this polling, which I find very interesting. So Institute of Race Relations has come out with the recent poll. This follows on the heels of a Social Research Foundation poll. Some of you may remember that in the run-up to the last election, I was one of the analysts who said the ANC was going to fall below 50%. Back then, people were questioning whether it would be 50. They ended up actually falling below 40 if you combine both ballots. But effectively, polls do matter. Don't dismiss the polls entirely. They are directional, but what you can get a sense of is what the average of the polls is. And those averages tend to point you in a direction. They may not be perfect, but they can avoid you being led astray. So where do we stand right now if we take the average of these two polls right now? So this is quite incredible stuff, actually. ANC support seems to be plunging. Already, we know that the ANC is standing at about 39.7% of the vote when you look at the two ballots that brought us parliament. Now, in this SRF poll, they fall to 32%. And then in the recent IRR poll, they fall to just below 30%. So from their plunge to around 40, they now seem to be at an average of around 30, 31. And so once again, don't worry about the exact numbers, but the direction is actually quite breathtaking if you think about it, because what this would mean is that ANC support from mid or early 60s, not so long ago, has effectively been cut in half right now. A more precipitous political decline you would struggle to find. So the ANC is in real trouble in this GNU era. The DA, on the other hand, is actually performing quite well in these polls. So we have the SRF poll where they were at 25, which is a bit better than their roughly 22 in the election. But here's the big one, which is the IRR poll, which puts them just above 30. So, I mean, the IRR is doing a big song and dance about how the DA is now ahead of the ANC in a poll. I mean, 30.3 versus 29.7 is neither here nor there. They're neck and neck, basically. But what this poll does show is that when we look at the average of SRF and IRR, the Institute of Race Relations and the Social Research Foundation, DA is at about 27. Now, what they don't say, but what I think is equally interesting, is if we look at the EFF and MK. Because I think MK will be quite happy looking at recent polling. SRF had them at 12, IRR has them around 16 now. 16 for MK. So this talk of a major decline after the election and all this upheaval affecting their results doesn't seem to be borne out. So they're on an average of 14, which is exactly where they were. EFF also going up to 10, around 10 in the IRR poll. So averaging around 8 right now. So here's the bottom line. And this is where we move from polls to analysis. I must say, I'm not in love with how the SRF and the IRR then interpret these numbers, but I do give them credit for giving us the numbers. I think their biases creep in when they interpret them, but not so much when they actually produce the data. So I do take the data very seriously. Here's effectively how I interpret the numbers. South African politics is splitting into 3 virtually equal poles. You've got the ANC on 30, the DA around 30, late 20s, and then EFF plus MK, same, late 20s, could be 30, could be 25. So you've effectively got these 3 blocks. One in the center, the ANC, one on the right, the DA, and one on the left, EFF and MK. And the question going into the next national election is which one of these 3 poles is able to take the ascendancy and then actually call the shots when the next governing coalition comes about. That's, of course, if the EFF and MK can find each other. But if they don't find each other and they continue with this policy of criticism between each other, then they allow themselves to be divided and then ruled by either the DA or the ANC in future coalitions. But effectively, we've got 3 poles emerging in South African politics. What we also obviously hear from this poll is that South Africans are still not happy with the ANC. Could be the VAT increase, could just be the general lack of movement in this GNU. Nothing really happening, no growth really happening, no unemployment really falling. And President Ramaphosa, who used to be a tremendous electoral asset for the ANC, is quite deep into his presidency. And the deeper you get into a presidency, one of the laws of politics is the less and less capital you start to have because people start to get tired of you. You're no longer the new kid on the block or the fresh, shiny thing. So the ANC is in serious trouble here. Now, another important aspect that we can take away from these numbers at the moment is that when you look at this coalition arrangement, for the coalition to hold over the long term, both the ANC and the DA need to feel like they're doing well. Now, what usually happens in a coalition is that one of the parties does well at the expense of the other party. And that seems to be what's emerging in the data here. The DA is doing well at the expense of the ANC, who's not doing so well. Now, that could be because the public perceives that DA ministers are doing better in their jobs. Maybe the DA just has better communications. Maybe people are looking at the Western Cape and the governance of Cape Town versus cities like Joburg. It's hard to know, but if these polls are pointing in a direction, it's of ANC declines at the expense of the DA. And in fact, opposition parties like EFF and MK are at present not doing any better or worse. So when we look at that, and of course the caveats need to be entered that undecided voters haven't been allocated, etc. But when we look at that, that would tend to militate for me towards the ANC breaking up its relationship with the DA in the medium to long term. Because sooner or later, the ANC is going to turn around and say, the DA is making gains on the back of being within government. This may have raised their profile, and it's coming at our expense. Now, if you add onto that the factional dynamics, which are underway within the ANC, these polling numbers may well embolden a more radical faction within the ANC that is pretty much being led by Paul Mashatile, which has always been opposed to this DA-ANC marriage of convenience. The SACP, COSATU, and the radical or more left-leaning parts of the ANC may come together to say this GNU is actually punishing us electorally in addition to being against our ideology. And the DA has now actually pulled the electoral rug from under us. So, while many have said that the ANC has scored tactical victories, This poll would suggest that, in fact, the DA may be scoring the ultimate strategic electoral victory over the ANC, as the ANC scores these tactical victories about hogging the portfolios, passing its legislation, even ramming through this VAT increase outside the coalition framework. So a very interesting set of numbers to follow. And of course, I'll continue to follow lots of different polls, whichever ones come out, and also do that work of averaging them for you so that you can see the direction in which things are heading. So that's the polls, and that's where we are right now. Of course, the IRR poll happened simultaneously with a lot of this budget chaos. So I want to get into that next. Now, the South African budget has been nothing short of a fiasco. From the moment where the Minister of Finance had to unceremoniously withdraw the tabling of the budget at the last minute, to a committee meeting where both the standing and select committees of finance, who had to pass the fiscal framework, which is basically a kind of guide to what the budget needs to be, not being broadcast, which I thought was just a shameful decision. And we really do need to ask questions of Parliament. How could such an important meeting not have been available for public scrutiny? We should have been able to watch every second of that meeting, but instead, I believe Parliament put it in a room where the parliamentary channel couldn't broadcast it. Other broadcasters were wrong-footed and they couldn't broadcast the full meeting. And there was some other meeting, which I'm sure was quite important, but couldn't have been as important as the decision on South Africa's entire budget. And so we weren't able to watch that sitting, unfortunately. But those committees in Parliament then came up with some strange decision to continue to vote for the fiscal framework, but parties like Action SA then decided they were going to add recommendations to the framework, which effectively meant that they both approved and disapproved of it, but in law they allowed it to go through, subject to some provisos. And this then set a train in motion where people have been battling to see, is it legally possible, once Parliament votes for this fiscal framework, which includes the VAT increase, to actually reverse that before some of the other budgetary processes come into operation? Is it actually possible to backtrack on this VAT increase? And that has really dominated our politics ever since. Now, in Parliament, we saw the ANC being able to cobble together a makeshift majority to pass that fiscal framework once it had come out of the committee. And what happened there was they went outside of the coalition and they got support from the likes of BOSA and the likes of Action SA. And they managed to just about pass that fiscal framework, which again meant the VAT increase was largely entrenched. Now, some reports, including one from News 24's Carol Payton over the weekend, have suggested that these parties have been now meeting to reset the so-called GNU. And the ANC's been meeting with a bunch of different parties to say, okay, we've got this budget problem, and how do we actually restore a coalition and build consensus around an agenda going forward? Now, in their meetings, it seems that the ANC as a party is actually amenable, according to these reports, to reversing VAT. But the question is whether it's actually legally possible at this point, because it's already been approved. Now, I just think at the moment it's unclear. I'm sure some wise legal, economic, and political minds are looking at this. But ultimately, if the political will is there, I'm sure a way can be found. Maybe if not right now, then maybe in the October budgeting cycle, things can be reversed. If not, for the next budget, at least that additional 0.5% can be curtailed. But maybe even before the 1st of May, which is the deadline for this, we might get something that comes out of these VAT negotiations. What it seems to me has happened is that opposition parties have united, both inside and outside the GNU, to make it categorically clear to the ANC and Treasury that if the ANC tries to go forward with the next stages of this budget, namely the stage where the government has to decide how much provinces and local government and national government gets, in other words, the division of revenue bill, or how much national departments get, in other words, the appropriations bill, if the ANC keeps this VAT thing, they may not have the numbers for those other stages of the budget, and then the chaos just increases and the uncertainty grows. Fam, giveaway alert. Win 2 weekend passes to the Cape Town Jazz Festival. Here's how. Number 1, follow at Cape Town Jazz Fest and official Cape Town Jazz Festival on Instagram. Number 2, on Twitter, like, comment, and share the contest post @_SMWX. In your comment, name any performer at this year's festival and include hashtag Cape Town Jazz Festival @SMWX. Entries close Wednesday at 5. Good luck. So it looks to me like opposition parties have actually got the ANC to seriously consider climbing down. So over to the Ministry of Finance. Now, there have been these allegations that Treasury operates as an island, and that it even is the tail that wags the dog in terms of ANC policy. So now the question is, can Treasury find mechanisms? Can legislators find these legal mechanisms? And if they don't, it comes back to our earlier decision about the ANC's falling support. Because I think this decision to die on the hill of a VAT increase has really hurt the ANC electorally at a time when it desperately needs public support to rebuild its electoral image. And at a time when the ANC had slid to around 40% of the vote, the idea that they would hold on to the further punishing of South African taxpayers in a way that is skewed towards the poor is going to be one of the electoral mysteries that baffles historians in generations to come. So if the ANC has any sense, they will find a way to do this. Now, as all of this is happening, there's an interesting legal dimension to all of this, because on the 22nd of April, there is an urgent court hearing where both the DA and the EFF, which I find interesting when you get those two parties agreeing. The ANC has managed to unite the DA, the EFF, and MK against this VAT increase. That takes some doing. To get Helen Zille, Julius Malema, and Jacob Zuma to be like, you know what, I actually agree on this issue. And so the DA and EFF have launched this urgent application at the Western Cape High Court to effectively halt this VAT increase and later actually declare some of the legislation which governs these questions as unconstitutional as a whole. So let's dive into this case a bit to give you a deeper understanding of what's going on legally. So remember that committee I spoke about that basically passed that framework which talks about the general direction of the budget, the fiscal framework. Now, the DA and the EFF allege that the committee that passed that framework, which eventually Parliament voted on, was actually invalid. It pursued procedural irregularities, and this is why it's so unfortunate that we weren't able to watch that committee. And its report was irrational to the extent that it both agreed to and disagreed with the fiscal framework. And I would add, although this is not part of their papers, it was irrational in the sense that it wasn't broadcast to the public and therefore contravened access to information, which is a cornerstone of our Constitution. So their court applications, the papers of which I've seen in preparation for this piece, are based around two steps. In Part A, both the DA and the EFF want to halt the implementation of that committee's report, i.e. the VAT increase, and pause the status quo, which is the VAT where we have it right now. And once it's paused, they then want to have a deeper Part B of their application, which looks at the constitutionality, particularly of the powers of the Minister of Finance to effectively unilaterally declare the VAT under the VAT Act, which I think is in Section 7.4, where it vests the Minister of Finance with the power to declare VAT, whereas that should be a legislative decision. So these parties are then going to try to declare some of the legislation around the passing of the budget as unconstitutional in and of itself. And so we've got this interesting parallel legal action happening with all this political intrigue. And the DA have said that they're not dropping this case. And when you look at the papers, you understand why, because it's a deeper application than just the VAT increase is wrong. It's both saying that the procedures that were followed were irrational, but also that some of the actual legislation which governs this process flies in the face of the Constitution and prevents the legislature from applying adequate scrutiny to these important questions of setting the budget. So next week, I believe that application will be launched, and SMWX has actually applied to broadcast those proceedings. And drop a comment down below. We want to start broadcasting some of these court cases in more detail, because I'm a bit dissatisfied with the way that, number one, live broadcasts of court cases happen, but number two, the way that court cases in South Africa are really only about one aspect of an argument and not the other aspect. We need to see what Parliament will say in response. I imagine Parliament's response will be that the DA and the EFF may not have liked the outcome of the committee, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles when you don't have a majority. But that'll be interesting, because the DA is also in court saying that it's not just about parliamentary majorities. In the Hlophe matter, there has to be a certain underlying rationality of a decision as well. So that'll be interesting to see. So comment down below if you want us to start covering these cases and court cases in more depth. The EFF and the DA have a point on this one, I think. And it's going to be important to get some scrutiny, some judicial scrutiny over this process. Just on a deeper level, though, I think this budget process has actually been a fascinating interface of law and the legislation around the budget, which I'll admit many of us, including myself, had no idea of beforehand, because the ANC just used to pass budgets with ease. Then there's politics. And there's economics, because of course this is all about the economy of the country. So it's a really fascinating intersection of those three junctures, or those three roads. Okay, so that's where we are with the GNU stuff. Now, I must say though, furthermore, within this political section, the GNU says it wants a reset. And they say they want rules, and they want a proper coalition to bind them, agreement to bind them, and they want a proper policy agenda and real power sharing. And I'm like, but the GNU has been around for 10 months now. Why don't they already have rules? You're telling me we've had a coalition. This is why I continue to say that, in the first few months of the GNU, I came on here and I said to you, I don't think there's any real agreement binding these parties. And until we see that, we can't pass judgment. And you said, no, you're jumping too soon, Sizwe, give them time. They need to figure it out. Okay, 10 months is a lot of time. And still, no rules, no proper agreement, let alone a policy agenda. And I sit here and I ask one more time, what's it going to take for us to get a government that is coherent around what its goals are, what policies it's actually pursuing, rather than constantly bickering about the policies, how it's going to pass a budget, and how internally within that coalition they're actually governing themselves? You can't have a government that doesn't govern itself, because how are you going to govern a country if you can't govern your own coalition? So we have a serious problem on our hands, and this idea of a GNU reset has laid bare that nothing has happened. As for the so-called clearinghouse that resolves policy disputes, I'm yet to see what has been cleared in which house. So I have a serious worry that we have a coalition built on vibes that is not actually a coalition on paper or in practice. And when you have that situation, you have what we have constantly seen over the last 10 months. You have these breakups and these makeups, back to breakups and makeups, and ultimately the citizenry suffers. So until I see a transparent coalition agreement between all the parties, which tells me how they intend to resolve disputes, what the voting procedure is, what the policy agenda is, then I'm afraid to say we're just going to see this cycle repeating itself every time a controversial piece of policy comes before the floor of Parliament. Now, furthermore, we saw MK, and the EFF, I think, doing the right thing. Because the ANC seems to have this strategy that they will use and abuse opposition parties when they need them for a majority, and then throw them away and run back into the arms of the DA later. So clearly around this budget thing, the ANC tried to scare the DA by saying, well, then if you don't like this VAT thing, we'll go to the EFF and MK. And to their credit, the EFF and MK both individually stood firm and said, we're not here to rescue you from your VAT shenanigans. And I think the EFF and MK are growing wise to the strategy of the ANC of picking them off when it's useful and discarding them when it's no longer useful. So, where do we go from here as we conclude? Keep a very close eye on the court proceedings, keep a very close eye on the polls, and keep a very close eye on internal ANC politics. Why do I say that? Because Cyril Ramaphosa is probably weaker than he has ever been at this point. He's no longer the darling of the South African media that he once was. But his party is facing electoral annihilation in the local government elections, if these poll numbers are to be believed. And that could embolden those who aspire to the ANC throne, not only to change course in terms of the coalition dynamics, which are apparently harming the ANC in the eyes of its own voters, but also to change leadership course. And of course, there'll be two major hurdles in the near future. The number one is that Phala Phala Concord case. If the Concord comes back with an adverse finding against the president, things are going to be rough. That's going to be the next time the GNU is tested. Look, if he makes his way through that and Parliament make their way, squeak through that Phala Phala Concord case, I think it'll be very disappointing. But the court may err on the conservative side, in which case the president can heave a huge sigh of relief, because I think his presidency hangs in the balance on what that court comes out with. But then again, we'll then go to there'll be more policy questions and there'll be more budget questions, and we'll have the division of revenue appropriations, but then there'll be NHI and there'll be education questions and expropriation act questions and various other policy related questions. There'll be foreign policy challenges. There'll be questions of how we respond to this lashing out of the US every 2 weeks against South Africa. So the GNU will be tested, but if we get to the local government elections and the ANC gets pummeled again, I think we will see big internal changes there. So thanks for keeping it locked on SMWX. A reminder about our live event on the 25th of April. I'd love to see you there. Come through. It's at the Artistry, Sandton, 25th of April. Looking forward to joining the SMWX community in person. So often I'll bump into people, they say they watch the podcast, and I never get to actually meet the people behind this podcast because I'm usually talking to this camera. But it'd be great to actually meet some of you who really watch the podcast and have been part of the SMWX fam for a long time. So looking forward to seeing you there. Catch some of our other content. We spoke to Errol Musk recently on this budget question. We had interesting conversations with Ngabayonzi Kwankwa from the UDM and the DA's Mark Burke. And drop a like, share this into your family WhatsApp group or your politics conversation WhatsApp group or your classes WhatsApp group, and keep it locked on SMWX. Let me know if you agree, disagree with any of my analysis below, and catch you on the next one. Aye.